what's up guys? I am back and I'm very happy to start my Contradictions of Capitalism series. I'm going to start with the contradiction between monopolies and competition. So today will basically be a giant BTFO to the neoclassical idea of perfect competition and all of the laughable assumptions that go along with that, such as rational expectations, perfect knowledge, etc., etc. If anyone is looking for like a serious, blow the fuck out of neoclassical economics, I would really recommend Anwar Shaikh's lecture series, which I will link, I'll link some of them below. I'll link the ones that are relevant to competition, but you can check out the rest because they are awesome. So I'm going to use a few clips of him here just to, hammer a few points home. But he basically explains that the classical tradition, so classical economists like Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, they were analyzing actually existing capitalism. They were analyzing actually existing business relations and social relations, in which it was understood that there were power differentials, there were obviously different classes, laborers, owners, etc., and that the relationship or the processes of capitalism were conflictual. The neoclassical tradition, on the other hand, thanks to the politics of the time and their desire to portray capitalism not as this crisis-ridden, conflict-ridden kind of a sphere of differential power dynamics, but as an ideal system that, brings the most satisfaction to all at all times. So instead of starting from the point of production, neoclassical economists started from the point of exchange. And from the point of exchange, superficially, it appears as though everything is equal, right? There's just two people coming in, making a conscious choice that's going to maximize their own satisfaction. And it doesn't matter if you're an owner or a laborer or whoever you are. It doesn't matter where you fall in the hierarchies. Everyone's wants will be satisfied. There will be full employment. It'll just be mutually beneficial transactions, voluntary transactions occurring at all times.
But you can see how powerful vision this is if you want to represent capitalism as an ideal system. So with this point of view, you begin with exchange, and everybody knows from those early models of exchange, the diagrams, Edward Bowley box diagrams, where two consumers exchange with each other, and in their mutual exchange, each one gets better off. Now, interestingly, that same notion is applied to trade. So therefore, in international trade, you don't say that trade takes place by businesses trying to seek profits and getting the most out of them, as Adam Smith says, as Ricardo says, as Marx says. You say instead, each nation can be viewed as a consumer, as a trader, and these two trades will not take place unless everybody is better off after them. So it follows that international trade also improves the satisfaction of a nation. The trouble with those things is that they've never worked empirically, but they work and they persist because they perform a powerful ideological function, which is to represent capitalism as an ideal system.
So in order to uphold this vision of capitalism as, super efficient and only there to serve the consumer, you have to make some assumptions about perfect competition. So number one, every firm is alike. So in essence, there is only one firm. Or there's, a million firms, but they all have different names, but they're essentially alike, so there's really just one firm. Every firm is very, very small in relation to the market. So every firm is just infinitesimally small, so much so that they do not believe that they will have any impact on the market, basically no matter what they do. And this is done to abstract from the idea of demand. So they are basically demand indifferent, and that they think that they can just produce whatever, and it's not going to actually have any influence on the market because they believe this will not happen because they are too small. Every firm is a price taker, not a price setter. So they do not set prices. The market just decides. The market gives them the price, right? Nobody is setting prices. And as a price taker, it seeks to maximize its own satisfaction, which is its own profit.
So if I go in and I observe firms setting prices, I'll say, aha, imperfect competition. If I observe firms take into account other firms, I'd say imperfect competition. In fact, if I observe any firms at all, I will always end up saying imperfect competition because the construction is so bizarre that it does not survive any observation. And again, one has to ask, how can something last 130 years as the dominant paradigm if it is contradicted by the empirical evidence? The answer is because that's not the issue. It is providing a powerful foundation for the understanding of society.
So this idea of perfect competition is so foundational to this liberal myth that capitalism is this wonderfully ideal system that will satisfy the wants of all, and it will produce the most desirable results because competition will weed out the bad, it'll keep only the good, only the ones that are satisfying people's needs will be kept in, it'll regulate prices, it'll regulate industries, it'll regulate employment. So it's a very, very powerful concept, and in this view, monopoly is viewed as abnormal, as an aberration. It's usually blamed on state intervention or something of the like. And yet, looking at material reality, something that orthodox economics is quite allergic to, we see that where liberalization has proceeded the most, nearly every industry has concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, into fewer and fewer firms who do exercise degrees of control over the market and who are not merely passive price takers. So today we're going to look at why this is, a natural progression of capitalism and not just some wonky aberration that we could fix if we just liberalized a little bit harder, which I think is always the most hilarious argument, like, everything we've been doing so far has been going horribly, so why don't we double down on it? Oh shit, double the trouble. Well, why don't we double down on the double down?
Oh, brother.
So we're going to look at 3 different viewpoints today from within the Marxist perspective. When I had the idea to make this video, I really saw it being a very straightforward video about monopolies versus competition, but very quickly, once I just kind of went down the rabbit hole of debates going on, even within the Marxist tradition, I realized this could very easily be the most complicated video that I ever make or that you ever see. So I'm just going to really do a cursory overview and link a bunch of things in the description box. If you're interested in these debates and you want to look further into it, you can check them out. So we're going to look at David Harvey, Anwar Shaikh, and the Monthly Review School. Monthly Review encompasses Sweezy, Braun, Foster, McChesney, whole whack of scholars within that school. So Harvey sees competition and monopoly as kind of oscillating back and forth together in a kind of contradictory unity. Although he has made clear that the centralization and concentration of capital is a clear progression of the accumulation of capitalism, the Monthly Review position can be traced back to Lenin's discussion of imperialism as, the highest stage of capitalism. And they believe that we are indeed in a monopoly stage of capitalism now, where monopoly power and not perfect competition is the rule. And this, they say, completely demolishes the political and the economic defenses of capitalism, which are that competition ensures rational allocation of scarce resources, which justifies the unequal distribution of incomes, and that economic power is diffused and that it cannot be aggregated in such a way that it would have undue influence over the democratic process. If monopoly and not perfect competition are the rule, then all of those defenses of capitalism are basically bunk. Anwar Shaikh says that even though it is true that the idea of perfect competition is completely ludicrous and bunk, and therefore so are many, if not all, of the other assumptions made about capitalism that kind of spring from this idea of perfect competition, perfect knowledge, perfect equilibrium. Even though it's true that that conception of competition is bunk, we should not abandon the concept of competition itself, and we should talk about real competition instead of this ridiculous perfect competition that has never existed. So he accuses the Monthly Review School of basically taking the same position as the neoclassicals in thinking that there was actually this golden age of capitalism, near the beginning, where things were perfectly competitive and it was so much better than it was today, and we've just moved past that into this next stage of capitalism where things are defunct. And where Shaikh says, perfect competition is so absurd, like it has never ever been this way. All that we have ever seen has been real competition, and that is what Marx has been observing even since his time. So even though these debates are a little bit animated, I think that they do agree on more than they probably realize, but the two are kind of coming at it from different angles, and kind of what's at stake is how are we defining monopoly, and how are we understanding the implications of that. So Anwar Shaikh talks a lot about profit rates as defining monopoly, so you would expect monopolies to have higher than normal profit rates. But this is, this is not the only thing I think that we need to think about, and it's not the only thing that he is thinking about, but, he points out that empirically it's not always the case. Sometimes they do maintain higher profit rates, sometimes not. But I don't think that the monthly review school is really saying that this is, absolutely the case across the board. There's a whole bunch of other things that goes into how we are defining monopolies, and I think we have to think more broadly about what the implications of this are. We have to take seriously the fact that there are 6 conglomerate companies that basically own everything now. It's just, what does that mean for labor? What does that mean for the consumer? Like, this kind of sweeping power that it's assumed that the consumer has doesn't really make sense if there's just a few major conglomerates that are just owning everything. Because let's say, you have Nike and Adidas or whatever. This is not really an example, but let's say, I really hate Nike because of their practices with sweatshops. So, okay, I'm gonna boycott them and I'm gonna buy from this other brand. Well, guess what? Both of these companies are owned by this parent conglomerate, so you're just basically giving your money to the same people no matter what you do. And that kind of concentration, obviously, as we have seen in the United States, as we have seen everywhere, leads to an undue influence over the democratic process, leads to influence into politics and things that go beyond just talking about profit rates and price setting and things like that. So if you want to learn more about these debates, please see the description box below. But regardless, it is clear that all industries are concentrating into fewer and fewer hands, if you will, or fewer and fewer firms, and that the idea of perfect competition and all of the assumptions that go with it about capitalism as an ideal system just go right out the window. So what is the result of throwing that in the trash can for labor? In rivalrous competition, where firms are price setters, not price takers, one of the major weapons you have against your opponents is your ability to cut costs. Because if you can cut costs, then you can cut your price and still maintain profit. So how do you cut costs? Once again, you put a downward pressure on labor, you can reduce wages, you can take your business offshore where you can pay people slave wages next to nothing to make your goods, you can hire inmate labor and pay people literally nothing. You're basically just enslaving them to make your goods. You can try to extend the length of the working day or reduce, good conditions of work. You can produce with the cheapest materials possible and in the cheapest way possible, which environmentally usually means the least sustainable or environmentally sound. So this kind of rivalrous, not perfect competition has very big implications for labor. And we've seen this especially since the 1970s, the rise of neoliberalism. Labor's share of the output, or the labor share of the surplus, has just been decimated. Labor has just been decimated. So common to every point of view in the Marxist tradition is that capitalists want monopoly. Capitalists seek out monopoly. That is their raison d'etre, basically, of having a company, is to try and increase your market share. No rational business person actually wants a ton of competition all the time and feeling unstable about, your profit margins. So Harvey explains that monopoly is not an aberration, but it is a systemic problem that arises from what economists call rent seeking. And this is really straight from Marx, by the way. Just the centralization and concentration of capital is the natural tendency of the accumulation of capital. One of the most important historical changes affecting the competitive conditions of large industrial corporations was the emergence of finance as a driver of the system, with power increasingly shifting in this period from corporate boardrooms to financial markets. Big money is more readily available to big firms, and so finance, along with competition itself, becomes one of the main levers in the centralization process. And we can witness this centralization and concentration of capital everywhere we turn. This table shows the percentage of sales for the 4 largest firms in selected US retail industries. This is also called the 4-firm concentration ratio, and we can see that they rise dramatically in all sectors. Most remarkable was the rise in concentration in general merchandise stores, symbolized by Walmart, which represents monopsony capitalism. Walmart uses its power as a single buyer, thereby monopsony, as opposed to monopoly or single seller, to control production and prices. The world's major airlines have coalesced into a handful of mega alliances. For example, just one of these, the Star Alliance, includes all of these other airlines. So they have achieved greater economies of scale by pooling assets, whether they're planes, code-sharing capabilities, frequent flyer programs, catering services, training, etc. The result is, in effect, a global fleet of aircraft operating under the leadership of a single dominant carrier, in this case United, which is pretty fucking troubling since we see how United treats their customers and the fact that we don't really have a choice. So in the 1970s, with the onset of neoliberalism, it appeared to people that things were getting more competitive. Deregulating trade barriers opened up the playing field so that foreign companies could challenge national ones. An example of this is the automobile industry and the complete decimation of Detroit and its descent into a wasteland full of feral dogs. I should not say that because I know it's gotten better and I have comrades who do work there. But, I mean, we all witnessed that happen. So although from a national perspective it might appear that things got more competitive initially, this really just led to a global oligopoly of automobile production, where 5 multinational firms produce nearly half the world's motor vehicles. The 10 largest firms produce 70% of the world's vehicles. So if one of the main weapons that companies have in competition is price cutting, then why do we not see prices just like go through the floor? Schumpeter introduces the idea of co-respective pricing as an answer to this. Sweezy argued this as well, that oligopolistic firms had nothing to gain from engaging in price cutting or price warfare. It would only squeeze their profits and it would be matched by their competitors, so they wouldn't actually gain market share. So it didn't take firms long to realize this and to either indirectly or directly collude in price setting, which is again just a huge BTFO to the neoclassical perfect competition, but it doesn't mean that competition is eliminated. It doesn't mean that, you know, new players can't come in and disrupt the old hierarchies. And certainly new players can disrupt kind of old industries. So you had Netflix totally disrupting, you know, Blockbuster and all of those places like HMV, etc. So you can have new technology disrupting old monopolies that seem secure. The methods of competition also change slightly in situations of collusion. So instead of this price-cutting behavior, you'll see other things like a sales effort, like investing in advertising and branding and other things like that, so that you can charge higher prices, or you can charge monopoly prices just for having like a swoosh on your running shoe. Of course, cutting costs remains important to maintain or increase your profits, and in another video I will talk about neoliberalization and the global labor arbitrage and just the brutal, bare, horrible exploitation of workers in the third world to make our sneakers with swooshes on them. But thinking of the production of classes, the production of transnational classes, or a transnational capitalist class, brings us back to Harvey, who argues that the underlying contradiction between monopoly and competition is the contradiction between the classes themselves. He argues that the capitalist class has a considerable monopoly, or holds considerable monopoly power over the laboring class because they own private property. So they have a collective monopoly over the means of production or the means of financing in recent years. And we see the abuse of this monopoly power everywhere, with predatory lending practices, abusive credit card practices, hidden charges, etc., where big corporations or big moneyed interests add to their wealth hand over fist, even as the economy as a whole collapses and then stagnates. And you can check out my finance video to learn more about this. So I think I'll end here for today. Hopefully that was relatively straightforward. The takeaway points are that perfect competition and neoclassical economics in general are just fuck out of here with that. And I will let this brilliant man take us out.
One of the striking things about perfect competition of modern economics is it comes from a reaction to the political economy of the time of Marx and Smith and Ricardo, but especially the time after Marx, when the working class has become very active, and the ideas of conflict are inherent in the relation between capital and labor, the relationship between firms. And this notion is disturbing. It's disturbing to orthodox economics. And orthodox economics then moves away from the idea of analyzing how capitalism operates to analyzing an ideal system, literally called perfect competition. The early mathematical economists pretended that they were doing this project in the name of analytical refinement, but they're really doing it in the name of ideological displacement. They're moving away from a vision of a competitive, conflictual relation to a passive equilibrium and optimal relation. Interesting to me, prior to that, is that all of these developments take place in the worst Great Depression in capitalist history up to that point, which is called Long Depression of 1873 to 1893. Devastating impact on people, on businesses, on employment, on poverty. And in the midst of this real disaster are sitting the orthodox economists constructing a theory of ideal, perfect, optimal capitalism in which none of this can happen. What's that phrase when people come back from war and they have this stress disorder? What is that called?
Post-traumatic.
Post-traumatic stress disorder. So modern economics is a post-traumatic stress disorder of the 19th century. It arises from that. And this, by the way, is a very interesting parallel because in the next horrible event of capitalism of that sort was the 1930s, of course. And that in 1930s, not only massive devastation of workers and of firms and employment and output, but in Europe, the rise of the Nazis. So what is a more ideal time to invent the notion of rational choice and game theory? Sitting in the cafes in Vienna as the Nazis are roaming across Europe, von Neumann, Morgenstern, and others are talking about ideal, optimal choice. I find this incomprehensible, really incomprehensible. I can see it as a mental disorder, as I think it's Wesley Clare Mitchell calls this, a kind of rational choice theory is a mental disorder. But it's bizarre that it becomes then the dominant representation of human behavior in these contexts. From another point of view, it's not so bizarre because typically people confronting horrible conditions in the real retreat into some idealization. That's perfectly fine for literature, perfectly fine for poetry, but it seems to me a rather bad way for something that claims to be a science to be proceeding.